Hoko, there's no audio on your end.
How about now?
Good.
Okay, so when I said, can everyone see and hear me? Not everyone could see and hear me. All right, are we okay now? All right. So today we are again taking up 108 gates of Dharma Illumination, and we have now looked at gate statements for each of the 5 faculties of liberation as part of this section we're working on. About the 37 constituent factors of Bodhi, or awakening. So we've looked at belief, effort, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. Each of those things separately as a faculty. So the next 5 gates in the 108 gates take up each of these 5 again from a different point of view. So rather than pointing to each of these things as a faculty, now it's pointing to each of these things as a power. So each of these things as a faculty is a tool for dealing with whatever its opposite is. So each one of these faculties is useful for controlling or working with its own area of practice. Things as faculties are tools for managing whatever the opposite thing is. So we can look at each of these faculties as a tool for working with a particular thing in our practice or a particular thing in our daily lives. These things become powers when they become unshakable, when they can't be overturned by whatever the opposite is, right? So in one case, it's a tool, and then when it really becomes established in our lives or in our practice, then these things become unshakable, and then we can call them powers. So for instance, faith is the counter to doubt. Effort is the counter to laziness, of course. Mindfulness is the counter to heedlessness. Concentration is the counter to distraction, and wisdom is the counter to ignorance. So we've got this pairing, right? Each of these 5 has a pair, has an opposite, or has a partner. Each of these 5 also balance each other. So within the 5, faith and wisdom are a pair, so that we don't have blind trust in something, and also we don't get stuck in this, I'll believe it only when I see it kind of mind in our practice. So Zhi was an important teacher in the Chinese Tentai school. In Japan becomes Tendai, and of course has quite a close relationship with our practice. So Zhi says, if wisdom and faith are both present, then when one hears that any single instant of thought is itself the right thought of enlightenment, one's faith will prevent one from disparaging this teaching, while one's wisdom will prevent one from fearing it. In this case, the beginning and the end will both be right. But if one lacks faith, one will think of the saintly realms as so lofty and far removed that one has no stake in their wisdom. While if one lacks wisdom, one will become exceedingly arrogant, declaring oneself to be equal to the Buddha. Under such circumstances, beginning and end will both be in error, right? So these things, it's an example how within the 5 faculties, things balance each other. So wisdom and faith are a pair. Effort and concentration are another pair. They balance each other so that we don't scatter all our time and energy kind of running around frantically in every direction. And also, we don't just become inert. We don't just stop moving altogether and focus on one thing and kind of like never get up, right? We need the balance between calm and being still, and also making some effort, having some activity in our practice. So mindfulness is the 5th one. Now, mindfulness doesn't have a partner because we've got an odd number of these things. So mindfulness doesn't have a partner by itself. Mindfulness is necessary for the other 2 sets to stay in balance. So wisdom and faith being a partner, being a pair, concentration and effort being a pair, mindfulness keeps those pairs in balance. So that's the connection between these 5 faculties within that group. So since we've already talked about what each of these faculties are, I am not going to take each one individually again as a power. We've probably said just about all we can say about these 5 things, because even when we got to them as faculties, we had already encountered them elsewhere in these gates. So I'm not going to belabor that thing. Dogen wrote a fascicle, the Shobogenzo, about the 37 constituents of Bodhi. So I want to use that as the roadmap today for talking about these facilities becoming powers and how that happens. So the spoiler here is that in general, Dogen tries to demonstrate that the way these faculties become unshakable powers is that we realize there is no self that's cultivating them or exercising them. but these things are not actually about small self. These things are not actually about us. So you will see that theme as we go through these things, faculties into powers. Okay, so gate 63. The power of belief is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it surpasses the power of demons. So the demon being pointed to here is Mara. Mara is the embodiment of the hindrances to awakening. So, Mara's whole agenda is to keep people tied to the cycle of craving and aversion and the wheel of samsara. That's sort of the reason Mara gets up in the morning. That's Mara's job. That's his realm. He's always doing what we might call recruitment and retention, right? He's always trying to, recruit people for samsara and keep them there, keep them stuck there. So we first meet Mara, of course, in stories about Shakyamuni's awakening. In the Padana Sutta, Mara approaches Shakyamuni while he's sitting under the Bodhi tree, right? He's sort of made his vow to sit down under this tree, not to get up until he understands the nature of suffering. Mara shows up, and while Buddha is making his great attempt to understand suffering, Mara starts saying what seems to be some very kind things. Oh, you are thin and you are pale and you are in death's presence too. 1,000 parts are pledged to death, but life still holds one part of you. Live, sir, life is the better way. You can gain merit if you live. Come, live the holy life and pour libations on the holy fires, and thus a world of merit gain. What can you do by struggling now? The path of struggling too is rough and difficult and hard to bear. So, oh, poor you, right? This is too hard. You should give it up and, go about your life in the world and, remain kind of entranced by the senses. This is an easier, more pleasurable life. So Shakyamuni, of course, is a smart guy. He knows what's going on. He says, no, I see the legions of demons behind you. And, I know that you're just trying to tempt me away from awakening and becoming not trapped by this samsaric world. Of course, Mara's legions there being 10 kinds of hindrance, things like boredom and cowardice and uncertainty and craving and self-praise and all that kind of stuff, right? Buddha sees Mara, but he sees past Mara and says, I know you're coming in with all of these hindrances. I see what you're doing. You're not fooling me. So Shakyamuni says, I'm not getting up from here, for I have faith and energy, and I have wisdom too. So we talked about wisdom last time, right? We've talked about that a lot. An important aspect of wisdom is understanding the true nature of self. And Dogen says, in his piece on these constituent factors of Bodhi, that that's the basis of faith. The wisdom that understands the nature of self is also the basis of faith. So Dogen says, keep in mind that the root of faith in the Dharma is beyond self, beyond other, beyond any forcing of oneself, beyond anything contrived, beyond anything others have hauled up in their minds, beyond any objective rules or standards, and therefore it was transmitted unseen from west to east. What we call faith is a faith that is forged with one's whole being. It is invariably following where faith goes from the perspective of Buddhahood, which is following where our self, capital Self, following our self where it goes. Were it not based upon the perspective of Buddhahood, there would be no manifestation of faith. This is why it is said that we can enter the great ocean of Buddha Dharma by means of our faith. In sum, the place where faith manifests is the place where Buddhas and ancestors appear. So in the Mara story, that was not yet Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, right? That was still Shakyamuni. It's before his awakening. So he manifested his faith by not getting up. Even when Mara showed up and confronted him with all of these temptations, as a result of that faith, Buddha appeared, right? Shakyamuni has his awakening experience and somehow Buddha appears. So the place where faith manifests is the place where Buddhas and ancestors appear. So where we have faith, Buddha arises, right? So faith is a faculty in this case. It's dispelling the hindrances of Mara and allowing for awakening. So Dogen goes on to describe what faith looks like when it becomes an unshakable power, when it can't be overturned by doubt, right? Faith and doubt. So when faith becomes unshakable and it can't be overturned, now faith is a power. So Dogen says, belief as a power is being duped by ourselves and having no place of escape. It is being called by others and having to turn the head. It is from birth to old age being just this. It is tumbling over 7 times and carrying on regardless. It is falling down 8 times and gathering oneself together. Thus, belief is like a crystal. The transmission of Dharma and the transmission of the robe are called belief. It is the transmission of Buddhas and the transmission of patriarchs. So Dogen says, when we have faith, we can't deceive ourselves. The same way that Mara couldn't deceive Shakyamuni under the tree into giving up his practice. So it is being called by others and having to turn the head. It is from birth to old age being just this. So this is a natural response, right? We don't think about it. Somebody calls you, you turn around, right? It's a natural response. And he's saying faith is like this. There's no second guessing, right? We stop doubting, we stop wondering about ourselves, we stop wondering about what we're doing, and we just practice because it's the natural thing to do. Even though we stumble repeatedly, he says, we keep getting up. We have faith that, we need to keep getting up and going on. And more than that, Dogen says, is tumbling over 7 times and carrying on regardless. It is falling down 8 times and gathering oneself together. So what can we learn from falling down? Right? We can have some faith that going forward in this practice, we're going to stumble, we're going to fall down, we're going to wander around, and that's okay. That is in itself the practice. So what do we learn from breaking a precept? What do we learn from somebody's unskillful behavior? That those things, that stumbling, those mistakes go with this human form and are not a reason that faith should be broken, right? So finally, Dogen says that transmitting the Dharma and the robe are acts of faith. So where he says robe here, let's include Raksu, not just this. Let's include Raksu, let's include Wagesa. Let's include the invisible robe that goes with having a vow, having an aspiration, and not necessarily making that a public thing, right? So this doesn't leave anybody out. Those are acts of faith, I think, in several ways. If there is a preceptor and you've gone through that process, then the preceptor has faith that the recipient is wholehearted in wanting to do this practice, committed to upholding precepts and living by vow. The recipient has faith in the 3 treasures, right? If we never had faith in any of that, we wouldn't go forward on this path. So recipient has faith in the 3 treasures, recipient has faith in the practice, and in this way, the practice and the Dharma go on into the future. Right? Faith is established. Faith is unshakable because we're handing this practice, this faith from person to person, right? So there's nothing magical about Dharma transmission. I'm not a woo-woo sort of person. I don't think that purple clouds, come down from, at least that wasn't my experience. Purple clouds don't come down from the sky. There's nothing sort of otherworldly about that, but I have to say at the end of my transmission, I felt like I'd been handed something. Which was now my responsibility to take care of and to make available to other people. I was supposed to keep this thing safe now and carry it forward. So something happens there. It's not magic. But I think that's why discernment before ordination feels really important to me. There has to be some unshakable faith on the part of both the teacher and the novice. Otherwise, eventually, this thing goes off the rails, right? I need to have faith that the novice is well positioned to learn skills of clergy, skills of ministry, how to carry the tradition, how to make it available to other people in a useful, meaningful, skillful way. The novice has to have faith that I can help him or her to do that I will be there when this person needs support or needs help or has a question about how to do something. I will be there to teach and guide, and the person, makes the commitment to go forward and do that. So again, Dharma and practice go on, right? So I think there's some faith relationship there. Okay, gate 64, the power of effort is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not regress or stray. So the simple reading of this is that if our effort is firmly established in our practice, then we stop falling back into bad habits, right? So much of our practice is about seeing habituated thinking, seeing our sort of ingrained responses. So if we read this, in the most obvious way, we make some effort, the power of effort means we stop backsliding. We stop going back to our old habits. So Dogen, of course, being Dogen, reads the power of effort as being about a complete manifestation of unity in multiplicity, right? So we have this sort of not one, not two thing happening here. It's not something that's about our personal striving, right? Our personal effort. So he says, it is resting even when unable to take rest. It is taking rest when taking rest. It is being someone who is terribly unimportant. It is being one who is not unimportant. It is being both important and unimportant. It is the first moon and the second moon, in other words, the world of form and the world of emptiness. Shakyamuni Buddha once said, I am always zealous in my spiritual endeavors. That is why I was able to realize supreme perfected enlightenment. What he called his continual zealous efforts was his doing it totally, from head to tail, through the whole of past, present, and future. His saying, I am always zealous in my spiritual endeavors, is his way of saying, I have already realized Buddhahood. Because it is his already having realized supreme, fully perfected enlightenment, it is his always being zealous in his spiritual endeavors. Were this not so, how could he have possibly been continuously zealous in his endeavors? How could he have possibly already realized it? So this is all just another way of saying that Zazen is good for nothing, right? Our good old friend, Zazen is good for nothing. So when we sit, awakening is already completely there. If awakening wasn't already there, there would be nothing to manifest. So there's nothing we need to go out and get. There's nothing we need to gain or create. So effort is unshakable because the universe goes on doing what the universe does, what Uchiyama Roshi calls living out the life of the self, right? So that effort is happening. That effort is already unshakable. So within this one unified reality, myriad beings are carrying out their individual activity in whatever their Dharma position is. Within the world of form, people are making effort and making mistakes and backsliding and, sort of regressing to old habits that they're trying to break. In the world of emptiness, beyond good and bad, there is no effort. There's no individual beings, making some individual effort. There's no backsliding, right? There's no returning to old habits. There's no regressing or straying, as this statement says. So we have two, we can see this one reality from two ways. So seeing one reality from two sides, expressing two sides in one action is a main theme of the Mahayana. We talk about that all the time. Here it is again, right? So that's effort. Gate 65, the power of mindfulness is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not blindly go along with others. So we usually think of mindfulness as paying continuous attention to our experience moment by moment. In the early texts, that's generally the thrust of mindfulness. Later on, it's about remembering what Buddha taught. It's about remembering to practice. Don't forget to see through Buddha's eyes, right? In any event, it's an individual activity. It's something we decide to undertake on our own. Nobody can do that for us. As individuals, we need to make some commitment to mindfulness practice, and then we carry it out with this body and mind. So for some period of time, in some kind of circumstance, we are engaged in being mindful, some mindful activity. But Dogen, being Dogen, Dogen says mindfulness as a root, in other words, mindfulness as a faculty, is a withered tree as a mass of red flesh. We call it a mass of red flesh, a withered tree, and a withered tree is mindfulness as a root, right? So he's talking about a person sitting zazen. This is the withered tree, right? So he's, somebody sitting zazen, he says, is the faculty of mindfulness. That is the root of mindfulness. So although this person is alive, they're sitting still, they're not being distracted by whatever is going on around them or whatever is arising, whatever karmic circumstances are coming up and leading to thoughts and memories and emotions. So it's as though this person is a withered tree. So this is the withered tree as a mass of red flesh. So this is an example of the universe manifesting mindfulness. This is not about I'm an individual person called Hoko sitting zazen. This is about the universe doing what the universe does. So sitting zazen is itself a complete manifestation of mindfulness. So he goes on to say, we ourselves who are groping for the mark are mindfulness. So even when we're not acting skillfully, even when we're not able to be in touch with our own awakening, somehow mindfulness is still there. There is mindfulness that exists in moments of owning one's body, and there is mindfulness that exists in moments of having no mind. There is conscious mindfulness, and there is mindfulness in which there is no body. So in the worlds of both form and emptiness, mindfulness is always arising, right? So whether we're attached to the body or not, whether we're caught up in ideas about self or not, whether we're conscious of our physical presence, we've dropped off body and mind, whatever is going on here, mindfulness is already there. So again, it's not an individual activity, not an individual endeavor. So Dogen goes on to give many more examples like this to show that we are in the middle of mindfulness even when we don't feel like we're actively engaged in something called doing mindfulness practice or being in touch with awakening or mindfulness. So his point is there's kind of no escaping from mindfulness, right? It can't be overturned. Now it's a power. Mindfulness can't be overturned. We can't escape from it. There's no point at which mindfulness is not happening because it arises from the true self. And of course, the true self is always here as well. So the person sitting zazen as a withered tree is true self. Groping around, trying to hit the mark is true self. Whatever the body and mind are doing in the worlds of form and emptiness is true self. So there's no getting away from it, right? There's true self, there's mindfulness. So then he says, mindfulness as a power is a great brute pulling a person's nostrils, thus it is nostrils pulling a person. So here he's talking about a Chinese Zen story, which goes, Zen Master Shakyo Eizo of Bushu asks Zen Master Seido Chizo, do you understand how to grasp space? Seido says, I understand how to grasp it. The master says, how do you grasp it? Seido clutches at space with his hand. The master says, you do not understand how to grasp space. Seido says, how do you grasp it, brother? The master grabs Seido's nostrils and pulls them. Groaning with pain, Seido says, it is very brutal to yank a person's nostrils, but I have directly been able to get free. The master says, directly grabbing hold like this, you should have got it from the beginning. Right? So, this is a famous story. You might have encountered this before. Dogen has written about it in other places in his writings in the Shobogenzo. So Shakyo, grabbing Seido's nose, is pointing him back to his true self. The nose is true self, and Shakyo's true self is what's doing the pulling. So we have true self encountering true self. So this is all about that. So Dogen says mindfulness is the nose pulling the person. So mindfulness is what happens when we manifest true self. And there's no point at which we're not manifesting true self. Therefore, mindfulness never goes away. Mindfulness is always here. So he ends this section by saying, even if used by all people in the world, it will never be eroded. So now mindfulness goes from being a faculty, paying attention to our moment-by-moment experience in an individual kind of intentional way, to being a power. Because mindfulness is not separate from true self, and true self is always here. No escaping from mindfulness. Okay, gate 66. The power of balance is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we discontinue all thoughts. So again, balance here can also be concentration. When we did talk about balance, we know I think I mentioned it's often the word there is concentration. So in general, again, it's about keeping the mind from wandering around, right? That makes sense. The more we settle, the better we're able to concentrate. The more settled and balanced we become, the cycle goes on. So balance and concentration are not separate, right? We can use either word, but there's something there about when we're settled, when we're better able to concentrate. These things go together. They feed each other, and the mind stops being distracted. The mind stops wandering around. So Dogen says that when balance is a faculty, it is like a rock enveloping a jewel. We cannot call it completely rock or completely jewel. It is like the ground bearing mountains. We cannot call it totally ground or totally mountains. At the same time, it springs out from the brain and springs in. So, non-separation, right? He gives several more examples of non-separation, holding two views kind of at the same time, or as we like to say here, seeing reality from two sides. So this is the context he's using for balance. So he says, balance as a power is like a child getting its mother, or like a mother getting her child. Or it is like the child getting the child itself, or like the mother getting the mother herself. but it is neither the swapping of a head and a face nor the buying of gold with gold. It is just a song growing steadily louder. So the bit about the mother and child finding each other might be a reference to a section of the Lotus Sutra that says that when we read and recite that sutra, we find our Dharma body mother, right? We sort of come home to our Dharma body mother. So in that way, balance and concentration is merging with the Dharma, or merging with the complete functioning of reality. Somehow we are embraced, if you will, or something, by something that feels like home, feels like a parent. So Dogen says there's a child and a mother finding each other, and also there's a child finding a child and the mother finding the mother. So again, form and emptiness, right? We're going beyond distinctions. So there's, in the big world, there's form and emptiness, and then we can also go beyond the distinction between form and empty. So there's, child and mother, and there's also child just being child and mother just being mother. All of these things are happening together. It is neither the swapping of a head and a face, nor the buying of gold with gold. So it's not being stuck in the world of differences, the world of distinction, and also not being stuck in the world of emptiness, right? So we're not buying gold with gold. So we need to see both form and emptiness and carry both form and emptiness, and also to be able to go beyond the distinction between form and emptiness. So there's a lot of non-separation happening here for Dogen. When we talked about concentration or balance, we said that one way to think about it, or one way to think about concentration, was as a refining of our practice. I talked about the word concentration as being, in English, we can think of that as refining, right? We're sort of letting go of extra, letting go of impurity or something, and refining our practice. So when we do that, our practice becomes more and more subtle, and we become more and more aware of subtleties. So Dogen says, it is just a song growing gradually louder. So that feels to me like when balance becomes an unshakable power, we're better and better able to hear the song, right? It feels like the subtleties become more clear. It feels like the song becomes gradually louder, and that happens in a very natural way. It's not like somebody went, turned up the volume on the radio. We become better able to experience, understand, see, be in touch with, maybe, the subtleties of this one unified reality. So concentration as a refinement of that. Finally, the power of wisdom is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we depart from the two extremes. So we've seen that wisdom as a faculty is a way to dispel ignorance. That means cutting through the delusion that keeps us from seeing emptiness or seeing all things as they actually are. So for those who've done some Dogen study, what he says about wisdom as power here is going to sound like a very familiar pattern. He says, wisdom as a power is of deep and long years, and it is like a ferry coming to a crossing. For this reason, it was described in ancient times as like a crossing getting a ferry. The point is that a crossing is inevitably just a fact of the ferry. A crossing is not being hindered by a crossing. A crossing not being hindered by a crossing is called a ferry. Spring ice naturally melts ice itself. So when we see with ordinary eyes, we see there is a ferry, which is separate from an activity we call crossing some kind of water, right? Or that somehow the ferry is in charge of that activity, or the ferry is driving that activity. Ferry is doing something, some activity, which we call crossing, and then there's some separation there. When we see with the eyes of Buddha, he says, a crossing is inevitably just the fact of the ferry. A crossing is not being hindered by a crossing not being hindered by a crossing is called a ferry. So ferry and crossing are arising together. Ferry and crossing are completely manifesting emptiness. They are as they are, and they do what they do in this one unified reality where things are just, carrying out their function from their Dharma position. So ferry and crossing don't hinder each other. They don't obstruct each other. So Dogen makes a similar point when he was commenting on the expression, the great sky does not obstruct the drifting of the white clouds. Elsewhere in the Shobogenzo, he writes about that, which is also a famous teaching. The great sky does not obstruct the drifting of the white clouds. So he says that the sky doesn't impede the sky from drifting, and the clouds don't impede the clouds, and also the clouds and the sky don't impede each other. So here we are again with mother and child, and also there's only child, and also there's only mother, right? This is a pattern that Dogen likes to use. So it's not that this non-obstruction is necessary before the sky and the clouds do what they do. We don't have to say, well, these things need to not obstruct each other, and therefore clouds are clouds, and therefore sky is sky. This is already their true nature. It's already there. This non-obstruction is part of this dynamic. There's nothing separate that needs to happen there. So Hojo-san says this is like what happens in our zazen. He says we just sit there, right? Thoughts come and go. Sitting doesn't stop the thoughts from doing what the thoughts do. Thoughts don't obstruct the sitting. So this now, when we think about ferry and crossing, clouds and sky, and da-da-da-da-da, now when we think about how does that feel in my zazen, we go, oh yeah, I get it, right? I'm sitting zazen, thoughts are coming up. Just because thoughts are coming up doesn't mean zazen isn't happening. Just because zazen is happening doesn't mean thoughts don't arise. Because of our karmic conditions, thoughts are going to arise. So these things are not hindering each other. It's not necessary to say, well, I'm going to get rid of my thoughts and then there's going to be zazen. Or I'm going to do zazen in order to get rid of my thoughts. Or then somehow thoughts are going to stop happening. Zazen is completely happening. Thoughts are completely happening. These two things are not impeding each other. These two things are not obstructing each other, right? So within this network of interdependence, or this one unified reality, everything is changing, arising, perishing, coming, going, right? We know that. Nothing is hindering anything else. All of these things are simply completely carrying out their Dharma function, and they're not being impeded by anything else that's happening. So everything, again, as Uchiyama Roshi says, is living out the life of the self, not being impeded by anything else. So when we can really see that happening, then that's wisdom. When we really deeply see the nature of our zazen and what's going on there, when we really deeply see clouds and sky don't impede each other, ferry and crossing don't impede each other, fish and water don't impede each other, that's wisdom, right? That's seeing with the eyes of Buddha. So, that's when we can do that, rather than seeing with our usual human eyes, then wisdom becomes an unshakable power. It's not like something that we have to gain. Tomorrow, I'm going to have some wisdom because I'm going to read a book, or I'm going to sit zazen or hear a podcast or something, right? It's not something we own, and it's not even about us. Wisdom becomes an unshakable power when we truly understand non-separation and non-obstruction, right? At that point, wisdom doesn't go away. So that's a quick round of the 5 faculties as 5 powers, how they go from being tools we might use in our practice to something which is established in an unshakable way that doesn't even require us or even practice. These things are already here. What would you like to say about any of those 5 powers, or about the group as a whole, or anything that might be bubbling for you today? That's a whole lot of Dogen, I get it. So, reflections from anybody today? And just unmute yourself and speak up. I'm not sure I can see clearly enough to call on people.
So thanks for your teaching. One thing that came up for me, and I would like to see if you or the group have any comments. When you were talking about faith and doubt, something that popped in my head was resilience. That keeps coming back up, resilience, and what that really looks like. And I know that's something that I personally have been working with in my practice, especially through the midst of everything, is being able to come back. So you or anyone else on the call, I would love to see your comments related to resilience.
Yeah, resilience. This is one of those cases where I think this is why Sangha is one of the 3 treasures, because it's really hard to do this practice by yourself. Just like it's hard to go forward in your life without some kind of support. And that doesn't mean, you've got lots and lots of people that you're sort of, pouring out your discernment on all the time. But I really think that a lot of coming back to this practice is that we see other people around us who are doing the same thing. I think it's a real boon to our own faith when we see other people of faith around us. So, the fact that people keep showing up, getting on the cushion, Maybe they've made some life commitment to this practice. Maybe that's a private thing with them. They haven't done that in a public way, but they have some faith. Is a real encouragement. I remember reading somewhere, and others probably know this better than I do, Suzuki Roshi in California. Somebody asked him once, what do I do about discouragement? And he said, encourage others. So if we think that it's not important that we keep showing up here for each other, I would disagree. I think, one of the important things about faith is that we share it with each other. And what makes us able to come back and sit on the cushion again and again and again. It's just helpful to know that we're not the only ones on this path, because this practice is not easy. We're going to hit bumps in the road. We're going to stumble 7 times and get up 8 times and go, what was that about? Right? So resilience in practice, yeah, we're going to get knocked back sometimes. And that's part of being a human being on this path. But I think when we've got Dharma brothers and sisters helping just to keep the Dharma alive, just to keep the practice alive, I think that's helpful. So, faith and doubt. This kind of faith, of course, is not about, well, I'm going to believe something because someone said so. This is a kind of faith where the more we sit and the more we actually see the effects of practice in our lives, of course, it's a strength. It strengthens our faith that, yes, this is a wholesome thing to do. Yes, I can actually move through the world like a bodhisattva, maybe not every moment of every day, but it is possible to manifest some awakening and to be in touch with something which points us beyond small self. Small self is absolutely here. We need to not ignore it, but there are days where it can be difficult to see beyond small self. And just keeping ourselves on the cushion, keeping ourselves on the path is not always an easy thing to do. So I think it's interesting how many people say, well, faith, we never talk about faith in Buddhism because we're not being asked to believe in a deity, or to believe in something which is handed to us. And yet, I think faith is a huge part of this practice. If we didn't have faith, why would we keep getting on cushion and looking at a wall for an hour at a time? I mean, that's a crazy thing to do, right? Who would do that? Unless we thought, Buddha had something going on. There's something here for me. All of us probably have some moment in our practice lives where something opened up for us. It's not that we've all been hit by lightning and ta-da, we have a grand awakening experience. But at some point, we heard some turning words. A teacher said something, we went, oh, wait a minute, yeah. Or we read something, or a Sangha friend, did something, and we go, oh, wait a minute, yeah. When we are wrestling with doubt, can we return to those moments and say, what was it that happened for me there? What was it that my Sangha brother, sister, friend showed me in that moment? Because it's probably still there, that's probably still around in the universe someplace. How can I get, kind of back in touch with that thing? So in moments of doubt, how can we return to the things that hold us up, whatever they are? Right? It might be that now is a wonderful time when we're not wrestling with doubt, maybe we are, to think about what were those 2 or 3 things that I have found most meaningful in my practice, those things that really hold me up, and write them down, draw a picture, stick a post-it on the refrigerator so that in those moments when Mara shows up and says, here's a bunch of hindrances, ha! See if you can practice with that stuff now. We got something, wait a minute, yeah, for Buddha, he touched the ground. He called the earth to witness and said, do you see, I am sitting under this tree. My faith is unshakable. Back me up here. We've all got that somewhere. Let's find it. What would others like to say about resilience? Something that's happened for you, something you're wrestling with, or if Satsu, do you have something you want to follow up there? Okay. Other folks, what would you like to say? What reflections do you have this morning? Mark is waving. This Myogen.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I have a comment on resilience because, yeah, the last year I had um, extreme doubt and yeah, in my faith and in my practice. And it was severe enough to where I had to talk to several people about it. And the one thing I'll say is, or the one thing that I found is that when you look at resilience, when you look at resilience, you're seeing a separation. When you're just being yourself, resilience is there. No matter what I did, you know, I may have, you know, in my doubt, I did not stop practicing. I may have reduced it a little bit. I kept going to Dharma studies. I have several that I go to. And one of the things I found was that I was just being myself, and my practice was myself. So there's just like these little things that would pop up. Like, you know, yeah, I would stop coming in the mornings, but I still maintained my do-on duties. But then I started picking up the mornings again. And one of the things I found is if, you know, you just look, you know, doubt is being ignorant. It's listening to that fear. But if you just go beyond that and just look at what's in front of you, the resilience is naturally there. The best example I can give is taking is your practice off your cushion. It's not taking it off; it is off. It is being off. Like we don't see it here because we're virtual, but in when we come back to Sand Chant, right? Um, what we do in that 10-minute gap between morning sazen and Dharma study is we stand and we wait and we help set everything up. That's a more physical activity than just getting a cup of water today. And when you stand in shashu. And I have found that that has been the most wonderful practice ever because when I go for coffee, I stand in shashu. You know, you may be jonesing for coffee, you're a little late and getting your caffeine, and you want to kill everybody who doesn't know how to order right? You know what you want, and they don't know what they want. It's like if they would just get out of the way so you can get your coffee, you'd be much, much happier, right? That's what's going on in your head, but you are thinking that, you are feeling that. But then when you look, you see, well, I'm in shashu. When you look and you down, you're in shashu, and it's just like, oh, oh, oh. So the thoughts are still going along, but you're going, oh, okay, that's okay. I'm just going nuts here because I don't have my caffeine yet. That is resilience. That is you being you. That is your practice. That is practice manifest here and now. So, and when you see that, and when you can see that, there is no doubt. There is just practice. So.
Okay, thank you. What would others like to say this morning? Reflections, ideas?
So I had a question about, could you say the name of the fascicle that you were drawing from this morning?
Yeah, so it actually is 37 constituents of Bodhi. I didn't write down the Japanese, but you can find it. It's
Okay.
within the Nishijimen cross translation, Shobogenzo translation. It's in I don't remember what number the fascicle is, but yeah, he's written a whole fascicle on those 37.
And sort of follow up to that, you had mentioned before that you've investigated sort of the meaning of mindfulness as it's evolved kind of throughout the progression of the tradition. So I hadn't heard that before, that Dogen basically like says the same thing about mindfulness as he does about other things like Buddha nature, that it's this, or awakening, it's like this thing that's always manifesting, and even if we're not participating in it, it's there. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that kind of understanding of mindfulness in the context of what that means in sort of the broader Buddhist tradition.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? On the one hand, I was surprised to read that fascicle and run across that interpretation of mindfulness. On the other hand, I wasn't surprised because it was Dogen, right? And he's all about the not one, not two, and things don't disappear and all of that stuff. So I guess when I think about the progression of what mindfulness practice, about the progression of that over time, in the beginning, it's very much about disenchantment from the senses, and it kind of mindfulness changes toward kind of remembering Buddha, remembering what Buddha taught, remembering to practice. But it feels like, yeah, on the one hand, that is an individual activity. I'm going to tie a string around my finger to remember that, when the guy in front of me in the car cuts me off, I'm going to take a breath. I'm remembering to practice. Oh, yeah, I took vows. Oh, yeah, I said I was going to have concentration and wisdom and compassion and all of these things. So there is the part that says it's not so much about I'm going to sit here in a meditative posture and let go of sense data. It's more about when I move through the world, I'm going to remember to take a broader view and manifest wisdom and compassion, all that stuff. There is that. And it then makes sense to me that Dogen takes that one step further and says, not only, is it about, yes, I'm making a personal effort, commitment, whatever, to be mindful and to remember what Buddha taught, but also it's not about me. It's also, the next step for me feels like, yes, there's that, and then there's also mindfulness that never goes away. Mindfulness that is just an element of true self. And because true self doesn't go away, then mindfulness doesn't go away. So, on one hand, yes, make an effort in this world of form. Do the Dharma study. Don't forget to sit every day. Try to remember to, not break precepts and not kill people and take their stuff and, disparage the Buddha and all that. Yeah, do that. And also, in Dogen's big view, because he's Dogen, he's saying, yes, do all that, but at the same time, recognize with the eyes of wisdom, with the Buddha's wisdom, mindfulness is already here. In a way, there's nothing you need to create because mindfulness is already here. So I appreciate your question because I hadn't sort of come to the end of that story. But what Dogen is saying feels like a logical extension of the sort of Japanese Buddhist Mahayana view of that whole mindfulness thing that might come right before him, right? So I appreciate that because that feels like that's closure. Although of course, practice doesn't stop developing, with Dogen in his life, but that feels like, yeah, that's the next step in the development of thinking about mindfulness. So I think it's a really different perspective on mindfulness from what we might encounter as, mindfulness as a productivity exercise, or mindfulness is a way to manage stress, or all the things that we kind of want to use mindfulness for today. Nothing wrong with that. It's not what Buddha's teaching. I'm sorry, it's not what Dogen's teaching about mindfulness. It's not transactional in the way that Zazen is not transactional. Zazen is good for nothing. So in Dogen's view, mindfulness is good for nothing. Here it is. We're not cultivating it for a purpose. It's like mindfulness is already here. So I think in that way, we can say when these 5 faculties become powers, they're all good for nothing, right? Concentration is good for nothing. Wisdom is good for nothing. Belief is good for nothing. Effort is good for nothing, because it implies that there's something that's going to happen outside of this moment. And yet, how do we step outside of this moment? So just like Zazen is not about a before and after, I think in this case, mindfulness is also not a before and after. It's not, I'm cultivating mindfulness to do something, or I'm, remembering what Buddha taught in order to something. It's just, here it is, right? No getting away from it. So I appreciate that question. I hadn't made that connection. Is there something you, from your perspective, would like to add to that, Doju? Because you've probably got some interesting reflections there as well.
I mean, I think it's a really useful kind of line to hear from Dogen, because of course, people are always asking about mindfulness, and sometimes it's a little bit, I think, in our tradition, hard to, point a finger at what exactly we have to say about mindfulness. I mean, I think that we have some misgivings about how it's been presented in popular culture, but being able to point to something like that and say, oh, well, Dogen, just as he treats Buddha nature, just as he treats awakening, it's something not special, something that's not hidden, something that we don't really have to do something magical to, participate with. It's just already there. So I appreciate the fact that we have that quotation, or now that I'm aware of that we have it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So again, there's this element of non-separation that says, there's not me and mindfulness. There's not me doing an activity called mindfulness. There's not even me paying attention to this moment. There is complete non-separation in Dogen's world. So, again, it's this teaching about it's not necessary for, if we want to come back to this sort of thing about non-obstruction, mindfulness is not obstructed. No matter what I'm doing, if I'm stumbling down the street and completely not paying attention to anything, and I would say I am not paying attention to my moment-by-moment experience, and yet mindfulness is not obstructed by that, right? So it's a really interesting perspective on it. And it might well be that we can consider how we talk about mindfulness with, for instance, Doju is, our main facilitator now for our getting started. He's the one who's, sort of taking in the new people and teaching them how to sit. So I can appreciate from your point of view, people are coming in having read or seen or whatever, they've got 32 apps on their phone about mindfulness and they're going, okay, Doju, what have you got to say about mindfulness? We kind of need to know what to say. So I do think that using that fascicle and thinking about mindfulness from sort of Dogen's perspective might be helpful. Yeah. Anyway, let me stop talking. What do other people want to say? Sagan, please.
Yeah, your discussion there reminded me very much of what Dogen teaches about the reality of we turning the Dharma wheel turning us, and finally the Dharma wheel turning the Dharma wheel.
Mm-hmm. It's exactly the same, right? It's the same. That's why I say, if you do any Dogen study, man, it's the same. It's the same pattern that keeps showing up. There's this, and then there's that, and then there's things that don't obstruct each other, and everything is exactly as it is. He's using multiple examples to try to point us to this reality, this one reality, right? Which we can't actually describe. What would other folks like to say this morning? Doju, are you waiting?
I just had one other sort of follow-up thought too, because one of the ways that mindfulness is often understood now, and I think this sort of comes from the Vipassana movement, is that it's sort of a bare awareness, where you're not thinking essentially and just sort of seeing things as they are. And then of course, you have the older view as that you were describing of it's actually keeping things in mind, which is almost the opposite, that you're trying to think about something. And I think what Dogen does is really, tie those two together in a nice way, because of course, kind of the world of thinking is the sort of the world of form, and the world of bare awareness is the world of emptiness or the absolute. And he's saying, no, it's, sort of both of these things together.
Yep, I think that's absolutely right. Good. Other comments this morning? Things to talk about, questions to ask? All right, we had enough for today? Okay, I'm going to pitch back to Mark. He's going to lead our closing chant. And Mark, I'm going to need to move this computer so that you can actually see me bowing here. So bear with me while this becomes a little bit frantic, okay? All right, thanks everybody for a good discussion.